So to understand the lead up to what occurred in May 1940, we have to go back. All the way back to 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. It's interesting to look at Franco-German relations and this odd sort of yin-yang they have with each other, to where as one is ascendant, the other one's typically crumbling, and vice versa. They exist with each other and can't exist without each other. To understand the Franco-Prussian War, you have to understand two men. Most importantly, Louis Napoleon and Otto von Bismarck of Prussia. These two men had very different approaches to life and their political aspirations, how they went about them. Bismarck's foreign policy approach and his approach to politics and other aspects of life could be best summed up by his motto that it was the duty of all politicians and leaders to wait for the opportune moments until they heard the sweep of the mantle of God, and then leap up and grab a hold of the hem with both hands. Now compare that to Louis Napoleon. Louis Napoleon's notion was effectively that fate would put him in the right place at the right time to do what he had to do. That seems he didn't think he had to do much preparation work, he'd just be where he needed to be and he would be ready, of course. Now, Bismarck had been working for many years to unify Germany. Around the 1840s, he seemed to have come to the notion that the German states needed to unify into what the Germans themselves called Klein Deutschland, or Little Germany, also sometimes referred to as Lesser Germany. This would be the sum total of the German states, minus, of course, Austria. Because not only did they not like the Austrians, but that also would have meant Austrian domination of the whole affair. It raised other questions. What are you going to do with the Austrian territories in the Balkans? Since unifying Germany doesn't really do you a whole lot of good if you also include a whole bunch of Hungarians, Romanians, Galicians, and what have you. Now, Bismarck, as was noted a moment ago, had been working for many years at it, and managed to seize former Danish territories in Schleswig and Holstein, along with securing Prussian supremacy over the German states in the north during the Austro-Prussian War. This was a 6-week conflict in which the Prussians ran roughshod over the Austrians, demonstrating that war had shifted tremendously. The Prussians possessed three main advantages during the war. They had a general staff, which drew up war plans and made preparations so when they went to war, it was simply a matter of sending out the right orders to the right units for where to go. They also had a very efficient system for how they organized their reservists in what they referred to as a zirkel or circle. Effectively, take a map and draw a circle that represents 1 day's travel. If I live inside that area, that's my depot, that's where I go when I get called up. So I'm never more than 1 day away from my regiment. And finally, they possessed what was called the Dreise needle gun. We can talk more about this in another video, specifically talking about weapons. Suffice it to say, it was a bolt-action, breech-loading rifle using a paper cartridge. It was self-contained, that, when compared to later weapons like the Mauser 1871 or even the French Chassepot, was really quite inadequate. For its day in the 1840s and 50s, it was really quite exceptional. Granted, an average Prussian soldier a rate of fire of around 15 rounds a minute, while most infantry and the rest of the world would struggle to reach 3. So following the crushing Prussian victory at Sadowa, the French realized that right on their doorstep they had a new major power in Europe that one day could threaten France's supremacy in the West. One of the advantages of German positioning, just naturally, is that sitting in Europe they can be both a great Western European power, the major Central European power, or a great power in the East. Which also leads to the disadvantage that they can border 3 great powers at the same time. In the meanwhile, in France, Louis Napoleon was not sitting on particularly strong footing. His regime was growing ever more unpopular. He had a strong surge of popularity when he first came to power, in large part thanks to the economic stagnation and general weakening of France under Louis Philippe and the other monarchs around that time. The fact that the Second Republic was never really on the most strong footing. It's just a common theme for French republics that they have a tendency to be just too flimsy. They don't have the ability to withstand pressures and challenges in the way that other republics can. And so, Louis Napoleon was trying to find a way to shore up his regime. Most of his foreign policy attempts were not particularly successful. He'd attempted to put an Austrian prince on the throne of Mexico. Poor Maximilian, Emperor of Mexico, ended his life in front of a Mexican firing squad. Not the most hospitable place to be. Otherwise, he'd attempted to build a canal across Nicaragua, which, while holding potential and is still a route that's periodically examined today, didn't really go anywhere. Perhaps his most successful effort had been the revitalization of Paris under Haussmann. It's a great rebuilding most of the city, adding wide boulevards the city's famous for, and open parks that people could go and visit as part of their leisure hours. Many of his domestic reforms have been quite successful, aiming at gaining the support of the working class, as he rightly recognized that in the future that would be one of the dominant forces in politics, sort of an early attempt to gain the proletariat to his side. Now, in the end, he wasn't particularly successful at that, in large parts thanks to the lower levels of France really being quite obsessed with the Republic and republicanism. Now, in most measures trying to court the lower classes, Louis Napoleon was not particularly successful. They were among the first to abandon him when things went south in 1870, and really left him behind and didn't look back very much. Now, as noted earlier, Bismarck was always very cagey, and following the victory at Sadowa, and the Austrians being booted from the German Confederation, never again allowed to have a voice in that particular body, there were still southern German states that were independent. He wanted to bring them into his vision of Germany, as just the North German Confederation was not intact and not everything it could be. If unified, Germany would have a huge industrial capacity and a massive population and numerous raw materials. It would be a great power overnight, right in the center of Europe. And around this time, European geopolitics were getting reorganized. The emergence of Italy meant that there was another great power on the map, although granted, Italy was certainly always rated as the weakest of the great powers, or perhaps the greatest of the minor powers. And as noted earlier, Germany would be a whole other beast, to have a huge population, massive industry, and a tremendous amount of raw materials ripe to fuel their new industry. However, Bismarck, trying to find a casus belli to go after France, knew he needed France to be the aggressor. He needed the southern German states to feel threatened. They needed to flock to Prussia. And so, in his words, he decided to wait until suitable opportunities presented themselves. Or something to that effect. I forget exactly how he put it. He was a bit more colorful in his language than I am. But such an opportunity appeared when the Spaniards ran their queen out of the country. Now, after some brief discussion, they decided they would remain a monarchy and began to look around for a suitable monarch to head the country. Bismarck had an idea. Bismarck always has an idea. And so to this end, he advanced Prince Leopold Hohenzollern, a cousin, or a nephew, I forget which, but a relation to the King of Prussia, Wilhelm. Now, he departed for Spain and he sent a telegraph indicating that he would arrive on the 29th. Now, due to some muddle, the Spaniards thought he was going to arrive much later than he actually did, and they couldn't just sit around for 6 weeks, and so everybody departed, went home, planning on rejoining. So Leopold shows up in Spain, expecting fanfare and welcome, and nobody's there to meet him. They thought he wasn't arriving yet. Consequently, he was tooling around Spain for an extended period of time, and eventually France began to put two and two together. Vacant Spanish throne, Prussian prince kicking around. Bit worrisome, that. Consequently, they protested most vociferously to the Prussian king Wilhelm, and after a bit of pressure from France, he assented and instructed Leopold to abandon his claim to the Spanish throne. Now, this was a capital moment. This was exactly what Louis Napoleon needed. If he could get a great foreign policy coup against the Prussians, this could help shore up his regime. Or, if it went to war, he was very confident in his chances against Prussia and felt that the French armies would simply run roughshod over them and that they would be able to enjoy supremacy in Europe yet again. Consequently, Louis Napoleon instructed his ambassador in Berlin to go to the Prussian king and demand that the Prussian king would promise that there would never again be a Hohenzollern candidate advanced to the Spanish throne. Now, Wilhelm didn't really see the merit in that. He'd already gotten Leopold to abandon his claim, and he really couldn't control things in the future after he's gone. However, the French ambassador made such a nuisance of himself, eventually the king declined to see him again, and went off to Bad Ems to go take in the waters there. So the French ambassador made such an ass of himself trying to get Wilhelm to agree to these terms, eventually Wilhelm sent him away, and then wrote up a brief synopsis of what had occurred and sent that off to Bismarck with express permission that Bismarck could release it to the foreign press. Now, when dealing with the Ems telegram, it's common to claim that Bismarck fudged it, which isn't entirely true. More accurately, he creatively edited it. Consequently, when the French would read it, they would look and they would think, "This Prussian king, the gall of him, he was rude to our ambassador." But the Prussians would read the same telegram and think, "This French bastard, he's being rude to our king, to arms!" Thus the French got their casus belli that they wanted, because if there was one thing that Louis Napoleon was always eminently skilled at, it was snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Which is sadly very true. And so ironic! One of the sad things about Louis Napoleon, he was always better at having his generals chase Vietnamese peasants around than chasing other soldiers around. Because I believe it was under him that they actually conquered Indochina. I guess on a note of the Indo-Chinese conquest by the French, the Vietnamese hadn't quite figured out that they could hide behind trees and shoot at them and dig tunnels. Because those were 20th century innovations. Now, as noted earlier, Prussia had a magnificent system for organizing its military. Not only were there reservists strategically placed, it was very easy for them to get where they had to go. The entirety of the rail networks in Prussia and the North German Confederation by proxy were eminently suited to moving troops from one side to the other. So von Moltke the Elder had observed the American Civil War very closely, and he understood a number of very important lessons from it. First and foremost, an army didn't get overrun in the same way that they used to, thanks to the higher rate of fire of modern weapons. Consequently, you didn't have to worry about your artillery being as vulnerable as it once had. Consequently, he would position his artillery forward, coordinating with the infantry, massively increasing its effectiveness. It certainly didn't hurt that the Prussians had widely adopted Krupp breech-loading guns that had a much higher rate of fire than the muzzle-loading pieces used by the French. Secondly, he understood that a train schedule could be just as powerful as any weapon under the right circumstance, since there you could coordinate troops and get as many troops as you could to the front while your enemy is still attempting to mobilize. With the general staff system, the Germans already had magnificent plans drawn up for a war with the French. Consequently, the German call-up went swimmingly. They got huge numbers of troops at the border. Meanwhile, the French had a complete muddle. Generals would show up not finding their regiments. Regiments would show up not finding their generals. If I was a French reservist, I might live in the north but have to travel all the way to the south to get to my depot. Consequently, you'd have train stations choke full of young Frenchmen trying to get where they need to go without food, shelter, or money to get where they need to go. The entire thing was a mess, and the French were able to mobilize less than half of what the Prussians did, even though they had a much larger population. Consequently, this first stage of the war was just Prussia running roughshod over the French. After a brief invasion of the southern German states by the French, it was all downhill from there. Eventually, one army was hidden at Metz, where they eventually would surrender, and Louis Napoleon himself was taken captive at Sedan, which is a whole other mess of worms in and of itself. And now, after these initial defeats, Louis Napoleon is overthrown in a revolution, and a government of national defense is formed. This is the beginning of the Third Republic, which was the political institution that fell in 1940 trying to fight the Germans yet again. Ironically, it was thanks to the Germans that the Third Republic came into existence at all, and it was thanks to the Germans that the Third Republic fell finally. Now, for the Prussians, this war was an unmitigated success. They captured the French Emperor, they'd crushed the French armies, but they had a problem. Who do you negotiate with? You've captured the Emperor. The Emperor is the state. In trying to sit down and negotiate with the French, they went nowhere. Consequently, they put Paris under siege for quite a number of months, and in spite of some very brave attempts to relieve the siege, they never quite were able to. And so, quite famously, on the 18th of January, 1871, Germany, as a modern, unified, compact state, came into existence. Now, the reason Germany didn't unify into a compact kingdom comparable to Britain or France is a whole other can of worms that needs to be opened for another day. However, at this stage, in 1871, the European rules of geopolitics were completely rewritten. All of a sudden stood a whole new empire capable of going toe-to-toe with any other one in a one-on-one fight, and most likely coming out on top. The only powers that could reasonably challenge it easily were Britain, thanks to the greatest moat in the world, the English Channel, and Russia, just thanks to the sheer size of the damn thing. However, even in this moment of victory and unity, at the end of the war, the seeds of the next war had already been planted. As part of unification, Germany annexed the French territories of Alsace and Lorraine. Now, inside Alsace-Lorraine, there's many people who speak German. They're of ethnic German persuasion. However, the French view these as being ethnically, linguistically, culturally French. This would be the equivalent of the United States losing a war and somebody amputating New York or Pennsylvania. It would not go over well. Consequently, for the next 40 years, up until 1914, the French, all students, were always taught that it was their duty to reclaim Alsace and Lorraine. And on all maps of Europe, the French always would mark Alsace and Lorraine in black, showing them to be amputated territories. Consequently, there were entire generations of Frenchmen raised with the sole idea that they needed to go and fight the Germans to get back this sacred territory. It was their duty. It's one of the features of French politics that helped give it life and give it organization. Louis Napoleon, for his part, passed away in 1873, going to England, spending the last few days of his life reading up on the Prussian reservist system and trying to study out what he could have done better. After he was released from prison in Germany, he actually sent a letter to France indicating that if they wished for his return, he was ready to do his duty. However, by this point, there were very few Frenchmen who were willing to back a Bonaparte to the throne. The last hopes of the Bonapartist force were extinguished when the Crown Prince, Louis Napoleon's son, fell fighting the Zulus in the British Army. Bismarck served for many more years as the Chancellor of Germany. Under the Constitution, which was basically copied from the North German Confederation, the Chancellor could only be appointed by the Kaiser and could only be removed by the Kaiser. He could propose legislation and was basically invested with more power than God. Coincidentally, Bismarck was the Chancellor. Surprise, surprise. Well, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, then please give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, maybe put a comment down in the comment section saying what we could do better next time. In the future, as part of Road to 36, we're going over the events that helped to shape the countries in the lead up to 1936. As this is sort of the year I view when World War II began. Certainly not perhaps the shooting portions of it, but the ideological struggle really comes to a head around that time. At some point in the future, we'll be covering the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, Great Britain, probably going into more detail specifically on Germany and France, Italy, Japan, and the United States. And at some point, hopefully have a chance to go over some of the minor powers that got caught up in it, like Australia, New Zealand, and the various other colonies. Till then, peace out. Now, obviously the French would take a very strong exception to this. They have the North German Confederation on their eastern border, and then a